Good evening and welcome to the Velocity of Now with me, your host, Thomas Sheridan. This is being broadcast on Sunday, but it's been recorded on a Thursday evening, yes. It's September 15th, 2009 while I'm recording this. The broadcast date will be the Sunday after this, which will be, just checking the calendar, will be the 18th. So the 18th you'll be listening to this. Now tonight's a special show because those of you who remember a few years ago when I was on the Type 1 radio network, I was doing a series of recordings there, and there was a lot of problems with sound, and one of the reasons there was a problem with sound was because I was using a stage mic I have from my music equipment. It's a Shure SM58 standard vocal microphone that singers use on stage, and every band you've ever seen has one and uses one. It's the classic stage microphone. It's been around since the 60s, I think. Now, in order to get that to work, what I had to do was put it through something that I'd bought for my guitar, and it was a Studio V3 tube amp. Now, what the Studio V3 tube amp is it takes the analog signal from the microphone. It processes the analog signal from the microphone through a classic vacuum tube, as the American calls it, or a valve, as they call it in this part of the world. Now, a valve is what was used in electronics before the invention of the transistor to increase what's called, well, they call it bias on the transistor, but without going into detail, it has two parts. It's a vacuum tube and it glows. It glows because one part produces a huge amount of heat as the electrons flow through it like a light bulb. The electrons float between two different plates, and this increases the volume. It's used like an amplifier almost. And that's how they used to amplify before the use of transistors. And those of you who remember your grandparents' radios, they used to have these old radios, and in the back you'd have the vacuum tubes. And if you remember, you're old enough, you'll remember your grandparents or your parents going into town to buy replacements because they used to burn out. Now, tonight's show will be an exercise in metaphysics. Those of you who remember those Type 1 shows, they were besieged or beset by what at the time seemed like audio problems, strange background noises. And this came to the fore in a broadcast I did about 2 years ago called the Jimmy Savile 666 Serial Killer. And all kinds of strange anomalies and noises appeared on the audio, particularly at points in the audio that was quite emotionally intense. I had basically introduced to the world my theory that night that I believed the former British DJ Jimmy Savile was himself a serial killer, not just a notorious paedophile. And he was almost certainly involved in one of the Yorkshire Ripper killings with Peter Sutcliffe of the prostitute Irene Richardson, who was basically found dead with teeth marks in the back of his apartment complex, Savile's apartment complex, and the teeth marks did not match up Irene Sutcliffe's teeth marks. At the time, even the Yorkshire police suspected that Jimmy Savile might have been the pervert that bit into the dead body or savaged a woman as she was being murdered. Remember, but the classic Louis Theroux thing, I won't go over the show, but Jimmy Savile said that women were brain damaged. Sutcliffe used to kill women with a ball-peen hammer and strike them on the back of the head. That's a hammer used by metal workers. Now, what was assumed to be audio faults at the time may actually be some kind of electronic voice phenomena. And we're going to try and create this tonight by asking specific questions Now, nothing may come of this. Some of you are welcome to get the audio. It may not happen during this segment of the show. It may take place later. This audio recording may be terrible quality and can't be used. But basically, the Studio V3 amp allows you to... See, one of the reasons I don't believe that all these things like Ghostbox and all these modern EVP, Ghost Voice recording machines work is because they're digital. They don't call it solid state for nothing. Digital is completely enclosed inside chips, often inside boxes that are heavily shielded. That means there's no electromagnetic resonance can come from outside. In a closed digital cold environment, where analog electronics, there's more of an electronic flux or resonance around the components. Now, in the early days of radio, especially when the earliest prototypes of the valve was being, or the vacuum tube was being developed, there was a belief among even serious engineers like Alexander Graham Bell that what they called spirits, believing they were ghosts, this was still when spiritualism was still raging, that these ghosts could actually pass through the glass of the vacuum tube, and in between the electron flow between the cathode and the anode plates inside the vacuum tube, they could whisper and talk into that area. So it was almost like it was the electronic world exposed into our world and was seen as a way of being in the ether. And remarkable experiments were carried out and some came to pass. Now this Studio V3 preamp, I currently have it set at neutral, which means it's bypassing the tube. I've also had this running for a bit and I want the tube to warm up. Now, when I start beginning the EVP experiment, I will switch it to the warm vocal setting, which then routes this digital signal through the analog vacuum tube and basically exposes my voice to the ether. And if there's anything out there who wants to appear, that was my cat Billy Meat, by the way, anything outside the ether wants to appear inside the vacuum tube, it can come through there. Now, I'm not using a pop shield on the mic, sponge or anything like that, so I apologize for my breathiness. I'm holding the microphone about 4 or 5 inches from my mouth, and I have the impedance, that means the magnetic field around the microphone diaphragm set quite low, so I don't pick up background noise. So it's very much a unidirectional mic right now. I'm trying to eliminate background noise. So therefore, any noise that appears is either right on the microphone, right literally on top of it, or within a few inches of it, or, we hope, coming through the ether of the vacuum tube. From the vacuum tube, it's then routed, that signal, that raw analog signal, is then routed through a digital processor and then goes into the USB and into the computer, and I'm recording it on Audacity, a direct feed. Now, when I did the 666 serial killer show on Type 1 with Steve those years ago, that's how I used to record the show. I used to record it by having the Audacity feed on. At the same time, I was sending the signal over to Brighton for the show to be broadcast. And this is how I did it, except I would have the preamp switched on to warm. That was giving me the idea was I was trying to get a nice warm radio voice that would go straight out. It didn't really work because it was picking up a lot of background noise, but now I'm starting to think that background noise might be very significant. Now, what this basically is doing is giving me a method to communicate between the electronic world and the physical reality around me, but in a multitude of frequencies, and not just in the range of human hearing, but because it's electronic and an extremely sensitive device, this fluctuation of electrons between the two plates picks up sounds that the human ear cannot hear. but it ends up being recorded. Now, before I start, I want to say that I thought about specifically trying to get a person, but I don't know, because as you know from my other work, that you cannot often trust these voices. They are liars. So this is why if you want to try and contact your Auntie Edith or your uncle, your Uncle Paddy, they will often say who they were. Now, I've been reading a lot about the early days of spiritualism, and one of the issues with spiritualism was that the earliest methods prior to the invention of the electronics, early analog electronics, was the use of a table with a glass, and 4 hands would hold the glass, or 2 hands, and then letters from A to Z, and then 1 to 9 and a 0, and then a yes and no, like a Ouija board, would be laid out on the table. And while this happened, people would ask questions. Now, this is quite fascinating, but also somewhat kind of funny. People back then were not always literate, so it was only middle-class people and upper-class people in England and America who were able to communicate from the other side. They were able to talk back. Illiterates couldn't. They couldn't spell. They couldn't read and write. So there was even a class system in the afterlife. Now, when dealing with different, shall we say, states of consciousness, the overwhelming thing is that when you die, you spend, this is a common thing. I did a show on the Velocity Now not so long ago, that you spend some time, after you've had a kind of a life review, you spend some time as something, as some kind of state where you're in a kind of a heaven, where you kind of make up for what you did in this real life. Not in a hell like you're being punished. So those classic stories of a man who worked in an abattoir, and to make it right, when he died, he constructed almost like a virtual reality pasture field for millions of cows, the souls of millions of cows to be happy in the next world. So it ties in very much with Vedic and Hindu philosophy. Then when that's done, after a while, you go to either your most common thing is to reincarnate, or you go to a higher level. This is a common thing. If you start looking at all the common beliefs around the world, this is basically the template or the framework. There is no death. Now, one of the problems is that when this person has spent time in this sort of lower astral realms and then moved on to, now I don't know if it's true or not, I'm just going by what I've commonly read and what's around the world in different traditions, and also in magic books this is stressed very deeply. A thing called an astral body is left. Now, the astral body is the former person who's been departed, but there's an astral corpse, and the astral corpse is what it's called. It contains the personality and the memories of the soul that inhabited it, but it dissipates after a while. It doesn't have as much power. And this is why I was thinking tonight of someone who was quite well known in the alternative scene who died recently. And I'm actually thinking of him inside myself, but I didn't want to do this in case this delayed the man's processing either to reincarnation or to the higher levels, whatever his destiny or choice is. So we'll just make this random and straightforward. We're going to try and just ask questions and see if we can get answers. But I do have a belief too that there are specific entities that do not move on, and I believe that Jimmy Savile is possibly one of them. Now, that doesn't mean he's here. It means he's in the electromagnetic spectrum, and that means I can pick him up through the ether, or should we say it, the strange world that exists between the cathode and anode plates inside the vacuum tube. Now, I'm going to switch on the vacuum tube, Now, because it's an analog device and it works on heat, I'm going to give it a few minutes to warm up, because it's not really effective until it warms up. There's no light on it right now, and I'm switching it to vocal. You probably heard some clicks. That's just the rotary switch going around, and it's now on vocal and warm. Sorry, vocal and valve. And I'm looking inside, and I can see the valve is now heating up. So it's actually starting. Yep, I can see the light and feel the heat coming off it. So the valve is on right now. You might hear some clicks. I'm just moving the thing over to make sure I'm definitely on the right setting. Yes, and there's the valve lighting up. Let me just switch the light off here. Double and triple check. This is like an old radio. So I'm definitely going through the valve, and hopefully I've had some problems with this microphone, so hopefully there's no noises in the background. Electronic noises caused by a fault in the cable or something like that. Right now, it's still heating up. It's not at a full glowing rate now. I'll give it another few minutes. Now, where I first discovered about this was there was a TV show, late night on the BBC about 10 years ago, that's never been repeated. You can't find it on YouTube. It's not on the BBC iPlayer. And it was an absolutely fantastic program. It dealt with the early days of occult radio, and it showed how early days of radio were affected by experimentation in trying to reach spirits. It was such a big business back then, and taken so seriously by mainstream scientists. Nikola Tesla picked up these strange voices too on his own recordings, but the Bell Labs were very much involved, because remember, there was also an economic aspect to this, because if you could actually prove that you've contacted the dead or whatever, you could become very, very rich or whatever. You could predict the future. You could actually sell this thing to families who lost or bereaved and so on, especially after World War One. Now, the valve is now heating up, and I wish I could remember the name of that documentary. There's also an article on my blog, which I'll post the link below, called Occult Science Radio. And you could read about some of this history on that as well. Now, you might hear some noise in the background. That's my bloody cat running around. I can't really stop him right now. And I want to stop the recording. But he runs around when he's happy, so he's not scared or anything, so don't worry about that. Okay, shall we begin? The valve is now heated up, and the experiment into electronic voice phenomena using this technique I've developed begins in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And of course my cat starts scratching. I have to wait for him to stop. You see, this is how you know it's real. Billy, stop. Okay, he stopped. Start again. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I would like to ask if there are any departed spirits or any other entities who are listening to this broadcast and can access the vacuum tube or the machine that's on the right to me with the light glowing, to please announce that you are here. Now, I can't hear anything because I have to put the speaker down because I'm trying to avoid issues with feedback. But I will ask again, and maybe people will hear on the radio, or the recording, I should say. If there are any spirits or any other entities who wish to communicate with people on the radio or through this machine to my right, where it's lit up in the dark, could you please leave a message now? We mean you no harm. We only respectfully wish to communicate with you. And if you could make your presence known, we would be grateful. even if you don't speak English or you speak another language, let me know. Now, I'll just let that run for a couple of seconds with silence, and then I'll tell you about how I'm feeling right now. Okay, I could see there's a few interesting blips on the signal that while I wasn't speaking, and we'll go back and explore them later. Now, when I immediately began to ask these questions, I'm sitting in a darkened room, and I've got my laptop on, of course, in front of me, and I've also got the machine on, and that's why I made mention to the light on my right, because we may be dealing with people who may have passed on but don't know what electronics are, but it may take them time to figure out how to get in here, so I will keep talking. But my initial experience was my hairs were standing on edge. It was not. It was certainly an interesting experience. Now, I am not adverse to doing things like this. I've crawled down to caves. I've done many things that are quite hardcore in terms of exploring, shall we say, the esoteric, the paranormal, the Fortean. But literally, when I began talking with this one, I felt a surge in my body, and I felt a sensation that was quite interesting. We must also bear in mind that my physiology, when that happened, may also create some kind of surges. So we're doing meta-science here. We're actually considering all the things. This is not like a stupid show like Ghostbusters where they go out and they think everything is Dick Turpin or something like that. Or Mary loves Dick. Mary loves Dick. To quote what's his name, Derek Acora, who I actually think is a lot of fun. But we have to discount that we may get nothing on this. Maybe some of you will have some kind of interesting sound equipment that can take this signal when it's put up on YouTube and do something with it. It's probably best if you listen with a pair of headphones. I will also change the gain on this because in order to reduce background noises, such as electronic noises from the microphone or any kind of shielding problems, which means like there's the magnetic shielding around the microphone cable if there's any breaks in it, I've lowered down that, but I've turned up the gain. So when I process this recording, it'll be much higher hearing it back. And it'll be that file will be quite useful. But I definitely saw during that gap of silence a peak that happened. So something was definitely picked up. Let's see what happens. I'm going to rephrase that question again. If there are anybody in this electronic field, anyone within this reality who's capable of communicating through the glowing light in the machine on my right, will you please make your presence announced, and I will give you approximately 1 minute to communicate. You have 1 minute, please, starting from, I'm going to wait till it gets to the top of the minute, starting from now. Please make your presence known. Okay, that 1 minute has passed. I didn't notice any peaks, but as I said, the amplitude on the wave is quite low. I also held the microphone away from my mouth. I didn't push it too far away, just in case it picked up any ambient breathing. I tend to breathe quite heavily as I'm an asthmatic and I have some lung damage from when I was a child. And so I moved the microphone away for that reason. Now, I still have that strange sensation, which I find hard to believe. Now, this house that I live in was actually belonged to a witch. I didn't know that when I bought it, but the only elderly neighbours here told me it belonged to a witch who vexed the entire community. Apparently she was a Protestant, and the area was Catholic in the immediate area, and there was some sectarian conflicts at the time of the turn of the century, and she is here. I've often felt her presence. Some of you have actually seen strange lights in my early videos on YouTube when I was using a cheap camera, and she's a benign individual, and I've never had any problems, and I've always felt very protected and safe with her in this house if she's still here. There's also an interesting woods at the back of my house that's rather, shall we say, unsettling. It's an old wood. It goes in, it's just immediately behind my backyard. It goes across a distance. Behind that is a bog, and behind that is the remains of a castle, a Norman castle that was knocked down a long, long time ago. I think it was knocked down as long ago as the Irish Confederacy Wars, probably 400 or 500 years ago. But the remains are still there. Now, interesting, on the site of that, there's a house that was built with a shop next to it, right next to where the castle was, and every single business has ever opened up since I've lived here, whether it was a shop, a gym, a computer place, and there was a few other things. There was a quad bike distributors. Every business flopped, and it should be a booming place because it's on a crossroads across from a large secondary school, and where there's 1,000+ students. So I mean, it makes no sense that everything flops. There's also been some personal tragedies in that house as well. I was also friends for a while with someone who lived in that house, and I never liked it there. I always, even though it was a modern house built in the 70s, I often felt spooked by it. I'm just trying to give you the environment. Around here, there are 2 fairy rings nearby, one quite substantial wrath from about 4,000 years ago. That's quite an excellent one. There's strong energies, and there's plenty of things like that sort of thing around here. There's no court tombs, but there is a couple of souterrains, which some people speculate were actually fairy houses. They're subterranean chambers. I'm randomly talking here just about these different things in order to maybe infuse a presence into the experiment. Again, I won't know until I play this file back, and I promise you I will not alter it in any way other than to boost the gain. Otherwise, it would go out very, very low on YouTube. That's all I will do. I will do no effects or anything like that, other than running it through the tube amp. And we'll go back again. We'll give it another minute. I will ask the question, and I'll give it maybe one more minute before, and then if there's anything out there wants to talk to us, I'll give it one more minute, a chance to make itself known. And then I'll do it once more before the end of the show. We're coming up to about the halfway point. So I'm going to do that in a couple of seconds. I will ask a question. I'm coming up to the minute. I'm looking at the time here. If there's any presence in this room, if there's any presence in the area, if there's any presence who can access or go beside the machine to my right, please make yourself known now. Are you here? And the minute has passed and I didn't notice any spikes up or down on that one either. But again, the sensitivity is set such that you won't know until you actually hear the file. Now, I want to talk a little bit about why EVP was better in the old days on analog machines. There were pluses and minuses to this. Do you remember the old cassette recorders that you had when you were a kid? That were they existed until probably about the early 1990s. The ones that had a little microphone that plugged in the side, or they had a little microphone built into them. When we had them, like anyone who's like over 40 had them when we were kids. Or boomboxes often had recording. You could record into them onto your cassette players. These were better for doing electronic voice phenomena because of the analog structure of the electronics. They did not record in digital. Now, what they were held back by was the quality of the microphones. Often the microphone was rather shitty. The microphone was generally not good quality. And so the best recordings that usually showed up in terms of EVP were people who afforded very expensive equipment. I think the very first EVP that's ever been recorded was I think it was a gentleman somewhere in Europe, maybe Sweden or Norway, who had a parabolic microphone, which is a microphone that looks like a big old-fashioned satellite dish you used to have in your house to get your TV back in the 90s. And this dish would record bird sounds from the woods. And this gentleman who was recording the bird sounds for a radio or TV show in Scandinavia picked up a voice speaking an early dialect of Swedish or Norwegian, whichever it was, and on describing what bird sounds are coming through and various characteristics of the bird. So it was like a bird watcher from a different time had joined in, and that really began the EVP craze. Now, again, if you had really good equipment, you could do this, but the only people that had really, really good equipment was, rich people or people who worked for TV. The rest of us were stuck with, our shitty recorders with a little small microphone trying to pick up sounds. Now, I had my first experiment in EVP was after reading an article in some paranormal magazine when I was a kid. I was quite young, I must have been 11 or 12, and I had one of the classic cassette recorders with a little built-in microphone, the top loader ones, with the little handle that took, 4 D-cell batteries, with the red button for record and play together down, and I put a C90 cassette in it, and sure enough, I got some very, very strange sounds. Now, people would often talk about that these were signals that were sent through the air, and it's quite possible, but these were definitely unusual things. Now, it's actually, believe it or not, easier now to do EVP without less background information because analog signals are basically gone. It's all mostly being broadcast now in digital, and digital signals are not picked up by these kinds of mics or through these kinds of equipment, analog equipment. So there's less, shall we say, smog in terms of the analog, that this is probably the golden age of analog recording. Now, there's a big move towards analog because people almost feel intrinsically safe with it. Baby monitors, for instance, they can be hacked into, digital ones, and you have these cretins who hack into baby monitors, the ones that have cameras in them, and they say disgusting things to the babies while they're sleeping, and the parents get very frightened and they hear these things in their house. That there's actually a demand now for old-fashioned analog ones that just transmit up and down. And guess what? They're hearing strange sounds. And it's probably because it's easier to us to communicate with other entities that are probably not in this realm through the analog world. Now, that was one case I did. Now, this is one of the reasons I lost interest in the magic of electronics, is when the digital switchover happened. Those of you who heard my talk, I think it was at AV6, on the digital gin, that I spoke about, that it's probably easier for non-material, shall we say, what you want to call the archons, to get into the digital world as algorithms and affect it that way than it was for them to get into the analog world. because we're, as human beings, and nature is analog as well. And so it's like that would be an ideal place for them to get into. And remember, they were a product of the Middle East. The Middle East is essentially where mathematics was developed. Algebra, and so on. Algorithm, and so on. So, we'll. I think this is a very worthy and plausible experiment I'm doing here tonight. I'm going to do the same again at the top, and I'll do it one more and then one more again before the close of the show, before it's over. And I'll just wait and I'll talk about something else in between. You never know, it might trigger something. So we're coming up to the top of the hour, the top of the minute, and I'm going to ask the question again to see if we can get any responses, because if there is somebody out there, we'd really like to hear from you. Even if it's Jimmy Savile. Jimmy Savile, we'd like to hear from you. Is there anybody there who would like to make their presence known? Please speak. And with the minute up, something interesting happened then. Again, on the sound mapping meters on Audacity, I saw nothing, but I distinctly picked up a fluctuation in the analog needle. There's an analog meter, an old-fashioned meter with a red needle on the Studio V tube amp. And it definitely moved right after I asked the question. Now, this happened with the Jimmy Savile 666 recordings. I'll try and take longer pauses between sentences. Some of my Facebook friends analyzed the sound, and they said that those sounds were coming through from the recording that were not registering on the wave of the program. And they brought the sound into their own more complex programs than Audacity, and said there was waveforms that were showing the same amplitude as me talking, and yet they were not registering on the meter, and yet they were there, which suggests that they were not, shall we say, vocal in origin. Well, not like from a human vocal cords, and they certainly were not caused by problems in the equipment. They appeared at specific times. Sometimes they would sound like a lion growling. Okay, that was interesting. Again, I saw the meter move after I said a lion growling. And other times they sounded like almost like water rushing down a plastic pipe. Don't worry, I'm not going to do anything like scream or go make a loud noise to frighten you. I would never ever do that. I take this stuff very, very seriously. Now, I think electronic voice phenomena is probably a very misunderstood thing. There's often the assumption, it goes back like every time somebody hears us of any idea of something other than a human in a building, they always make the assumption that it's a ghost or of a departed human being. Now, I'm not saying it couldn't be, but that also discounts other ideas that we may be dealing with, such as entities, jinns, dibbuks, fairies and nature spirits. I'm taking deliberately long pauses here between just to see if anything happens. And so they're often discounted. So I used to watch TV shows like that Ghost Hunter show. I think that's the one with all the plumbers in America. And I found those guys terrible. Those guys. And I found the show quite funny. But it's just like Time Team on Channel 4. Every room they find in England is a Roman villa. And every, and then everything, they find a few stones together in a line. It's instantaneously declared a Roman villa because there's some kind of bizarre psychosis in British archaeology that nothing existed before Rome. The Romans arrived. And the same thing on that show, Ghost Hunters. Okay, something very strange is happening. I don't know if it's that was strange. There was suddenly, I don't know if that was a short in the microphone. It might have been a short in the mic. I've lost the sound. Okay, can you hear me? Okay, that was something strange happened then. I felt like a little electrical tingle on my fingers holding the mic. I'm pretty sure it was a short, and then you might hear a buzz, and then I played with the XLR connector on the end of the microphone to get the sound back on. So that may be just a technical thing. So discount that. Or maybe not, but there was definitely a reading, and then it went, and I did not move the microphone. The microphone is in my hand, but that was interesting. Well, it's probably just a little thing. Now, I did a show the other night on Quran's on 333, and I don't want to get too much into that, but as some of you said, you found the show very interesting, and it just goes to stress how deeply we should take this stuff. This is not, because this is how deeply they take it. Do you think the likes of these earlier radio experimenters that they weren't aware of what they were possibly dealing with? I think it was Tesla who actually believed he was talking to he got voices from people on Venus or Mars, and then later on a secondary experiment discounted them. So that was kind of interesting too. That's a good question for me to ask. I'll ask the next question. I will ask if there's somebody from another world here. I'll ask that question in a second. Again, I want to wait till we get to the top of the minute, so I'll give myself a minute further on, and then I'll close the show out. It won't be a full hour, but hopefully there'll be something in here. If not, well, maybe it didn't work. Maybe it wasn't right. Maybe it never was right, but at least we tried. Is there anybody here that comes from another planet other than Earth? I would like to ask another specific question. Is there anybody here who recently died and passed on and would like to communicate with their friends or family members? Okay, for that one I got a very distinct tingling sensation up and down my spine. If there was anybody here who would like to tell us their name, if you can do so, tell us your first and second name. If it's difficult for you, just give us your first name. Could you please announce who you are? Thank you. Okay, now I didn't register anything then, but again I got that tremendous surge up and down my back. Again, this show is not designed to frighten anyone. It's just not designed to even give you hope. This is purely a meta-science experiment, a Fortean experiment to see if we can achieve anything. It's the kind of things I do when I go to megalithic sites. I don't do so many voice things, but I'm going to start doing it from now on. I want to try and find a way to make this equipment portable so I can take it into places like Owen Nagat Cave and other caves like the Caves of Kesh and anywhere like that or deep inside underground chambers, Neolithic chambers, and see if I can achieve anything. Now, this is an interesting experiment for me because I'm actually finding myself quite emotionally moved at this point. I'm not sure why. I'm not expecting to hear from anybody. I'm just throwing the ideas out there. And again, if you're sensitive to these kinds of things, just like the show I did the other night and some of the magic shows I do, it's probably not for you. And this is probably not something you should play for children. You should not. If there's any strange noises on this, you should not play them for children. So before the show closes, I've got about 10 minutes after this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to do a general announcement and let the microphone run for 5 minutes. I'll hold the microphone away from myself and I'll let it run for 5 minutes and give it 5 minutes to get there. Because if we're dealing with, say, non-material like fairies, it's well known within the Irish canon that folklore canon that they move at a different speed than we do. And there may be difficulty communicating. They talk too fast or they talk too slow. So I will try to do something like open a general thing. If anybody is out there, anything is out there, I'm going to give you a long time to try and communicate with people. You can talk to us here, and I'm going to leave the microphone open. That's the machine in my hand, and the light at the side. If you don't understand this machinery I'm using, go to the light on my right-hand side and talk into the light or communicate there. This is open to anybody and anything. Please make yourself known. concludes our EVP experiment. I will leave the signal going through the valve for the rest of the show. If anyone or anything did contact us, we bid you peace, we bid you blessings, and we bid you respect. And we bid you good news on your new abode. And we bless you, and we thank you, and we are honoured for you having us with us here tonight. Okay, so folks, I'll leave it with that. It's only a 1 hour show this week, but basically a lot of you are going to be probably analysing this file to see if you can hear anything. Remember, there's no loss in digital signal when you go from this onto YouTube, so the YouTube signal is as good as anything that I'm recording here tonight. I will have the raw signal, and I'll also have the signal done with the gain, so I'll keep them separate. The gain is just purely bringing up the levels to hear things that the human ear can't. Now, my experience of doing this here tonight is, one, I heard a ringing in my ear during that last long segment when it was open, and the pitch distinctly changed. I have slight tinnitus from my years in rock and roll, and it was there was a couple of changes in pitch. I also noticed some different noise ambient changes from the box itself, and the needle did move earlier on when there was no sound registered on this. So please use the comments on YouTube below. Use the timestamps function on YouTube if you find anything interesting, if you think you can translate it, and so on. And this is the purpose of my show. This is not just me involved in this experiment. We're all involved in this experiment together, because we're all. If no, look, this is what being a Fortean, being a meta scientist is about. It's about us sharing the data. This is like an open source file I'm giving to you. There may be nothing on it. This may be a complete waste of time tonight, but I just want to record this at least for posterity, because if nothing came through tonight, at least we know that we didn't get it, and maybe it doesn't exist, or maybe it does. Well, I know it does, but maybe tonight they weren't talking to us, and that's it. And anything you got an interesting show on my experiences with EVP and so on the Velocity of Now here on Thomas Sheridan Arts on YouTube, and I hope to hear from you soon when this is broadcast on Sunday, and hopefully we'll keep this conversation dialogue going. And any other suggestions you have for any kind of these experiments like this, taking the microphone into an old church, or there's some old ruins around here, I would definitely be open for that. So take care of yourself, and feck 'em if they can take a joke, and take care of yourself. Good night, or good afternoon, wherever you are.